The most expensive mistake a company can make is firing the person who understands where the bodies are buried inside the system. That was what my old mentor used to say back when cloud infrastructure still lived inside cold server rooms instead of billion-dollar investor presentations. At 59 years old, I finally understood exactly what he meant. My name is Evelyn Mercer, and the morning they fired me began with applause. The executive conference room on the 38th floor overlooked downtown Chicago, beneath a gray February sky, while senior leadership gathered for the quarterly compliance review. Fresh coffee sat untouched beside polished leather notebooks. Giant display screens showed revenue forecasts climbing across the walls. Everything looked successful, controlled, expensive. That was intentional. Public companies love performing confidence right before disaster arrives. I sat near the far end of the conference table reviewing infrastructure certification reports. I finished at 2:30 that morning after another 14-hour workday. 17 years at Halcyon Cloud Systems taught me something important about corporate America. The people carrying the heaviest responsibilities are usually the last ones executives notice until something breaks. Across from me sat Noah Whitaker, our 34-year-old chief technology officer hired 18 months earlier to modernize engineering culture. Translation: reduce older leadership, replace institutional knowledge with cheaper teams, and impress investors during acquisition season. Noah adjusted his tailored navy suit and smiled toward the board members gathered beside him. He looked relaxed. Too relaxed. Before we begin compliance review, he announced smoothly, there is an organizational transition we need to address. My stomach tightened immediately. Not because I was afraid. Because executives only use phrases like organizational transition when lawyers already approved the damage beforehand. The room became silent in the strange way corporate rooms become silent before someone's career gets publicly dismantled. Nobody looked directly at me anymore. Human Resources entered carrying a thin, black folder. There it was. Noah folded his hands together and delivered the speech exactly the way consultants teach executives to deliver bad news without sounding emotional. As Halcyon continues evolving toward streamlined infrastructure management, we are eliminating several legacy leadership positions effective immediately. Legacy. Such an elegant word for disposable. My fingers remained perfectly still against the edge of my notebook, while Noah continued explaining how younger engineering structures would improve innovation speed and operational agility. Agility. Another favorite corporate word used by people who never personally fix production outages at 3 in the morning. Then he finally said my name. Evelyn Mercer's role as principal infrastructure engineer has been eliminated effective today. No warning beforehand. No private discussion. No dignity. Just removal. Like deleting old software nobody wanted maintaining anymore. For several seconds nobody moved. I remember hearing the soft hum of the air system above the conference room ceiling while downtown traffic crawled silently far below the windows. One junior engineer looked genuinely horrified. Another stared down at her laptop pretending to type because she could not bear watching this happen publicly. Noah kept speaking calmly about future growth strategy, while Human Resources slid severance paperwork toward me across the polished table. 17 years. 17 years stabilizing emergency deployments during cyber attacks. 17 years sleeping beside my phone during infrastructure migrations because executives promised investors impossible timelines. 17 years protecting the company from compliance failures nobody else fully understood. And now they were erasing me between coffee service and quarterly projections. I signed the paperwork without saying a word. That unsettled Noah more than anger would have. Executives expect emotional scenes because emotional people are easier to dismiss afterward. Calm people frighten them. As I closed the folder, I asked one simple question. Who approved continuity transfer authority for the federal audit chain? Noah blinked once. Just once. Then he answered too quickly. Engineering already handled all transition requirements. That was the moment I realized nobody in leadership actually understood the system underneath them. Because if they had, Noah would never have answered that question so confidently. The federal audit chain did not belong to engineering alone. It belonged to infrastructure governance compliance tied directly to the cloud security certifications required for Halcyon's upcoming acquisition review. And every authorization signature inside that chain still carried my credentials. Security escorted me downstairs 20 minutes later, while employees watched quietly from behind glass office walls. Outside, freezing winds swept through downtown Chicago, while giant digital billboards across the financial district displayed headlines celebrating Halcyon's pending $800 million acquisition deal. Investors loved the company. Analysts called it the future of enterprise infrastructure. Nobody outside the building understood that the same executives celebrating growth had just terminated the only engineer who understood how their compliance architecture actually functioned. By 6 o'clock that evening, my company email disappeared. My employee directory profile vanished. My system credentials were revoked. They erased me fast because acquisition lawyers prefer clean paperwork before federal audits begin. But around 7:43 that night, while I sat alone in my kitchen staring at snow gathering outside the windows, my personal backup monitoring tablet suddenly lit up beside the coffee maker. One alert. Then another. Then 6 more within 30 seconds. Infrastructure compliance verification failure detected. Audit traceability chain incomplete. Regulatory authentication mismatch identified. I slowly picked up the tablet while cold blue warning lights reflected across the dark kitchen walls. Somewhere inside Halcyon Cloud Systems, people were already touching systems they did not understand. The next morning, downtown Chicago looked buried beneath freezing fog, while Halcyon executives walked into the office pretending nothing was wrong. Publicly, the company still projected confidence. Financial media continued praising the pending acquisition. Investors still called Noah Whitaker a visionary. But inside the engineering floors, panic had already started spreading quietly through the building. I knew because my private monitoring tablet kept lighting up every 15 minutes with escalating compliance alerts tied to systems nobody realized still referenced my infrastructure credentials. At 8:12 that morning, my personal phone finally rang. Daniel Reyes, Senior Infrastructure Analyst. One of the few engineers at Halcyon who still respected systems older than 6 months. I answered immediately because Daniel never called unless something serious was breaking. He sounded exhausted before he even finished saying my name. Evelyn, he said carefully. There is a problem with the audit chain. I almost smiled at the understatement. Daniel explained that overnight the internal compliance verification system started rejecting authorization requests connected to the federal cloud security review required for the acquisition. At first, engineering assumed it was a routine credential mismatch. Then the external auditors requested historical traceability logs. That was when everything started collapsing. The problem was not just access. It was continuity. Every major infrastructure deployment over the past 6 years linked back to governance approvals routed through my secured compliance architecture. Remove my authorization chain improperly, and the system treated those certifications as incomplete. Not invalid. Worse, unverifiable. I leaned back slowly at my kitchen table while snow drifted quietly across the backyard outside. Did Noah authorize a replacement signature chain? I asked. Daniel hesitated too long before answering. They thought deleting your credentials would automatically transfer ownership. There it was. The exact sentence proving leadership never understood the system underneath them. Compliance architecture does not function like social media passwords. You cannot simply reassign authority during active federal review without maintaining traceability records, especially not inside cloud infrastructure. Tied to enterprise government contracts. Daniel lowered his voice further. Legal is freaking out. I believed him. Federal audit exposure terrifies corporations because auditors do not care about investor presentations or executive charisma. They care about documentation, timing, accountability, things people like Noah Whitaker considered annoying obstacles slowing innovation. Around noon, another call arrived from inside Halcyon, this time from Melissa Grant in corporate legal. Her tone sounded entirely different from the polished detachment she carried during my termination meeting yesterday. Softer now. Careful. She asked whether I would be willing to discuss temporary consulting support regarding the acquisition review. Temporary consulting support. Amazing how quickly executives rediscover your value once regulators start asking questions. I asked her something simple in return. Did the audit team already notice the continuity gaps? Silence filled the line for several seconds before Melissa finally answered quietly. They escalated the review this morning. I stared at the falling snow outside my kitchen window, while blue compliance warnings continued flashing across the tablet beside my coffee mug. Somewhere inside Halcyon Cloud Systems, board members were beginning to realize they had not fired an aging engineer yesterday. They had accidentally destabilized the entire foundation holding their acquisition together. By Thursday morning, the atmosphere inside Halcyon Cloud Systems had shifted from confidence to containment. That was always the stage corporations reached right before panic became visible publicly. Executives stopped speaking casually in elevators. Legal teams moved between conference rooms carrying printed binders instead of laptops. Human resources postponed 2 recruiting events without explanation. And somewhere above the 35th floor, Noah Whitaker was still trying to convince the board everything remained under control. My phone rang just after 9 o'clock while I reviewed old infrastructure records from my home office. Melissa Grant again. This time her voice sounded sharper, less polished. The external auditors arrived. Early, she admitted quietly. That got my attention immediately. Federal acquisition auditors rarely adjust schedules unless preliminary findings already concern them. I walked toward the window overlooking my snow-covered neighborhood while Melissa explained the situation. The auditors requested complete deployment traceability for Halcyon's government cloud contracts, including infrastructure governance signatures tied to every major architecture update over the past 5 years. The problem was simple. Nobody remaining inside Halcyon fully understood how those approval systems interconnected because I designed them personally during a cybersecurity overhaul after the Denver breach in 2019. At the time, executives praised the system because it prevented regulatory exposure during emergency deployments. Now that same architecture was exposing them instead. Can engineering rebuild the verification chain? I asked calmly. Melissa exhaled softly before answering. Not without recreating historical authentication records.
Impossible.
Compliance systems built correctly are not supposed to allow historical reconstruction after the fact. That is the entire purpose of immutable governance architecture. Somewhere inside Halcyon, executives were finally learning the difference between software engineering and infrastructure accountability. Around lunchtime, Daniel Reyes sent me a private message from inside the building. Board members had gathered in Conference Hall C while outside auditors occupied 3 executive meeting rooms simultaneously. Security teams blocked access to several infrastructure servers pending review. Junior engineers were being questioned individually regarding deployment approvals they barely remembered handling. Fear was spreading now. Real fear. Not about technical outages. About personal accountability. Then Daniel added one final sentence that stayed with me the rest of the afternoon. Noah keeps asking where the missing approvals are. Missing. I stared at that word for several seconds. The approvals were never missing. They existed exactly where they had always existed inside secure compliance archives protected by authorization chains. Leadership improperly severed the moment they terminated me. Halcyon thought removing an older engineer would simplify their future before the acquisition. Instead, they had triggered the exact scenario my infrastructure systems were designed to detect. Unauthorized governance disruption during active regulatory review. By 4:30 that afternoon, financial analysts began quietly asking questions about unexpected audit delays surrounding the acquisition timeline. Publicly, Halcyon still looked stable. But inside the company, executives were starting to understand something terrifying. The system they depended on most was built by someone they treated as replaceable. Friday morning began with rain hammering against the windows of my home office, while financial news channels quietly stopped using the phrase stable acquisition regarding Halcyon Cloud Systems. Analysts still sounded careful on television because nobody wanted to trigger market panic prematurely, but the wording had changed. Delayed regulatory review. Expanded audit procedures. Infrastructure governance concerns. Those phrases alone were enough to terrify investors behind closed doors. Around 10:15 my phone buzzed again. This time the caller identification displayed Noah Whitaker directly. First call since my termination. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice still carried executive confidence, but underneath it I heard exhaustion now. Real exhaustion. The kind executives develop once consequences stop responding to public relations language. Evelyn, he began carefully, we need to discuss the audit environment. Interesting wording. Not apologize. Not explain. Just discuss. I leaned back slowly in my chair while rain streaked across the backyard windows. The auditors found the governance gaps, I said calmly. Silence filled the line for several seconds before Noah finally admitted the truth. They expanded the investigation into infrastructure certification history. There it was. The escalation phase. Federal auditors only widen review scopes once they suspect systemic governance failure instead of isolated documentation issues. Noah lowered his voice slightly. The board believes some approvals may not have transferred properly after your departure. Some approvals. Amazing how executives still minimize disaster even while standing inside it. I opened one of my archived deployment logs stored securely on my private legal backup drive. Thousands of timestamped certifications stretched across the screen tied to years of infrastructure migrations, emergency recovery operations, and federal cloud compliance validations. Every critical deployment at Halcyon passed through governance architecture. I built personally after the Denver breach exposed dangerous shortcuts leadership wanted hidden from regulators. Back then I warned the board repeatedly that compliance systems should never depend on executive convenience. Nobody listened because proper governance slows people chasing quarterly numbers. Did legal explain immutable traceability requirements to you before they revoked my authorization chain? I asked quietly. Noah exhaled sharply. That reaction told me everything. They never fully consulted infrastructure governance before firing me. Human resources handled the termination. Legal approved the optics. Engineering assumed technical ownership could simply be reassigned afterward. And now outside auditors were tearing through 6 years of infrastructure history, asking questions nobody remaining inside Halcyon could answer confidently. Noah spoke again, softer now. The acquisition partner suspended final review this morning. Outside my windows, thunder rolled across the dark Chicago skyline while silence settled through the room between us. $800 million hanging by a thread, because executives confused operational knowledge with replaceable labor. What exactly do you want from me? I finally asked. Another long pause followed. Then Noah answered with the sentence he probably never imagined saying 3 days earlier. The board wants to know if you can stabilize the audit before this becomes public. I stared down at the glowing infrastructure records spread across my monitor, while rain continued falling against the glass. 3 days ago they escorted me out of Halcyon like obsolete equipment slowing innovation. Now, the same leadership team was discovering something every experienced engineer already understands. Systems remember the truth long after executives rewrite the narrative. By Monday morning, Halcyon Cloud Systems no longer felt like a company protecting an acquisition. It felt like a company trying to survive exposure. You could see it in the market behavior before executives even admitted anything publicly. The company stock opened down 11% after financial reporters confirmed the acquisition review entered extended regulatory assessment. Investors hate uncertainty more than failure, because uncertainty suggests leadership no longer controls the situation. Around 8:45 Melissa Grant arrived at my house carrying 2 legal binders, and the kind of exhausted expression people develop after spending an entire weekend inside emergency board meetings. Rainwater still clung to her coat while she stepped carefully into my kitchen. Funny how quickly executives rediscover humility once auditors start asking for signatures nobody can produce. Melissa placed the binders on my table and looked around quietly at the simple house Halcyon executives probably imagined belonged to someone outdated and replaceable. The board wants a temporary remediation agreement, she explained carefully. Outside counsel believes you may still be able to stabilize the audit environment before formal escalation. Formal escalation. Corporate language for federal scrutiny severe enough to threaten acquisition approval entirely. I poured coffee into 2 mugs while Melissa opened the binders revealing hundreds of pages of audit findings, governance discrepancies, and deployment inconsistencies tied to infrastructure records leadership, improperly altered after my termination. They moved too fast trying to erase me. That was the real mistake. Not firing me. Panicking afterward. Noah told the board engineering could rebuild the traceability structure internally, I said calmly while reviewing the documents. Melissa actually looked embarrassed. They understand now that was inaccurate. Inaccurate. Another elegant corporate substitute for catastrophic miscalculation. I continued, flipping through the audit report slowly. Federal reviewers already identified multiple continuity failures connected to cloud security governance under government contract infrastructure. Nothing malicious. Nothing fraudulent. Worse, negligence. Regulators punish negligence more aggressively because it proves leadership ignored risk, rather than merely misunderstanding it. Melissa lowered her voice. The auditors specifically requested your original certification architecture documentation. Of course they did. External auditors always look for the engineer who built the system before listening to executives who inherited it later. I closed the binder carefully and finally looked directly at her. 2 years ago I warned Noah Whitaker that bypassing governance procedures for deployment speed would eventually trigger compliance exposure. Melissa nodded once. The board reviewed those emails yesterday. There it was. Accountability arriving quietly through archived records nobody expected to matter later. Outside my kitchen windows the rain finally slowed while gray morning light spread across the neighborhood. Somewhere downtown, Halcyon executives were probably still holding emergency meetings searching for strategies to contain damage already spreading beyond the building. But the truth was much simpler than they realized. The audit was not destroying Halcyon because systems failed. The audit was destroying Halcyon because leadership spent years treating responsibility like an obstacle instead of protection. Melissa slid a consulting agreement across the table toward me. 7 figures. Full legal immunity. Temporary executive authority during remediation review. 3 days earlier security escorted me out of Halcyon carrying a cardboard box. Now the same board members who applauded my removal were offering me control over the survival of the company itself. Tuesday afternoon felt strangely quiet inside Halcyon headquarters, according to Daniel Reyes. Too quiet. That was never a good sign inside technology companies under federal review. Loud offices still believe problems can be solved. Silent offices already understand consequences are coming. I arrived downtown shortly before 3 o'clock wearing the same charcoal coat I wore the morning security escorted me out of the building. The difference was impossible to miss now. Last week employees avoided eye contact while I carried a cardboard box through the lobby. Today people stood when I entered the executive floor. Respect changes quickly once fear enters the room. Melissa escorted me toward Conference Hall C where outside counsel, board members, and federal audit consultants waited around a polished oak table covered in binders. Noah Whitaker sat near the far corner looking exhausted beneath fluorescent lighting that suddenly made him appear much younger than 34. Stress removes executive polish very quickly. One of the lead auditors introduced herself calmly before sliding several infrastructure reports toward me. We need clarification regarding governance continuity failures tied to infrastructure certification history. Direct. Professional. No emotion. Auditors never care about office politics. Only evidence. I reviewed the documents quietly while legal teams watched me like surgeons observing a critical operation. The findings confirmed exactly what I expected. After terminating my authorization chain, Halcyon Engineering attempted to recreate portions of the compliance architecture manually to avoid delaying the acquisition timeline. That decision triggered dozens of traceability inconsistencies across federal cloud deployment records. Nothing criminal, but enough to destroy investor confidence once disclosed publicly. I finally looked toward the board member sitting silently across the table, who authorized engineering to bypass continuity lockdown procedures. Nobody answered immediately. Then one older board director slowly turned toward Noah. There it was. The moment blame stopped moving invisibly through conference rooms and attached itself directly to leadership. Noah cleared his throat carefully. We believed delaying the transition would create acquisition risk. I almost admired the irony. Their attempt to protect the acquisition had become the reason it was collapsing. The lead auditor spoke again. Miss Mercer, based on your original governance architecture, could these systems have remained compliant if transition procedures were followed correctly? Every eye inside the room shifted toward me at once. Lawyers, executives, board members, people who ignored my warnings for years suddenly waiting for my professional judgment to determine the survival of the company. I answered honestly because systems deserve honesty even when leadership does not. Yes, I said calmly. The infrastructure was stable before leadership bypassed compliance controls for speed. Silence settled heavily across the conference room. Not emotional silence. Financial silence. The kind that appears once executives realize disaster now carries names, emails, timestamps, and documented decisions. Outside the glass walls overlooking downtown Chicago, storm clouds rolled across the skyline while emergency investor calls filled executive calendars throughout the building. Halcyon still had functioning technology, still had clients, still had revenue, but the company was losing something far more valuable in real time: credibility. And once credibility disappears during federal review, collapse usually follows quietly afterward. By Wednesday morning, the story finally escaped the building. Not officially. Companies like Halcyon never announce collapse directly. They leak weakness through silence, delayed statements, and carefully rewritten investor calls. Financial reporters started using phrases like governance instability and acquisition uncertainty, while technology forums filled with anonymous rumors from frightened employees. Inside Halcyon headquarters, people stopped pretending the situation was temporary. Daniel Reyes told me entire engineering teams were quietly updating resumes during lunch breaks, while recruiters suddenly began calling senior staff after years of being ignored. Fear spreads fast in technology companies because engineers understand systems better than executives ever will. And engineers knew the audit was no longer about paperwork. It was about trust. I returned to the office shortly after noon under temporary consulting authority approved by the board 20 hours earlier. Security guards, who once escorted me downstairs, now held doors open while employees watched silently from glass conference rooms. Nobody looked arrogant anymore. The company felt smaller somehow, weaker. The giant digital screens celebrating growth projections had disappeared from the executive floor and been replaced with muted financial news coverage tracking Halcyon stock in real time. Down another 6%. Investors were running now. Melissa met me outside infrastructure operations carrying a stack of emergency remediation reports. The acquisition partner suspended negotiations indefinitely this morning, she admitted quietly. There it was. The real fracture. Not delayed. Not paused for review. Suspended indefinitely. $800 million evaporating because leadership confused experience with redundancy. As we walked through engineering operations, younger developers stared at me with expressions I recognized immediately. Not pity. Understanding. One junior engineer finally spoke as I passed her workstation. They told us the old systems were slowing innovation, she said softly. I stopped beside her desk. Stable systems always look slow to people who only care about speed, I answered calmly. Her eyes dropped toward the floor because deep down she already understood the lesson, arriving too late for the company around her. Around 3 o'clock, another emergency board session began upstairs. This time Noah Whitaker did not lead the meeting. He sat silently near the end of the table while outside legal counsel explained expanding regulatory exposure tied to governance override decisions after my termination. The board members looked older now than they had 1 week earlier. Stress ages executives quickly once money starts disappearing publicly. Then the board chair turned toward me directly. Miss Mercer, he asked carefully, in your professional opinion, can this company still recover credibility with regulators? I looked through the glass walls overlooking downtown Chicago, where cold winter sunlight reflected against steel skyscrapers built by people long forgotten by the companies occupying them now. Credibility. Such a fragile thing. It takes decades to build and only one arrogant decision to destroy. I answered honestly because honesty was the only thing left inside the room regulators could still trust. Only if leadership finally accepts that governance exists to protect the company from itself. Nobody spoke afterward. Because for the first time since the audit began, everyone inside Halcyon understood the same terrifying truth. The company was never collapsing because of technology failure. It was collapsing because leadership spent years believing responsibility was optional. Thursday morning, the resignation rumors became official. Noah Whitaker stepped down before markets opened under what the press release called leadership restructuring during ongoing regulatory review. Nobody inside Halcyon believed that wording for a second. Executives only resign quietly when the board decides public accountability matters more than internal loyalty. By 9 o'clock, every technology news outlet in Chicago carried the story across their front pages beside collapsing stock charts and speculation about federal oversight expansion. The company that spent years branding itself as the future of enterprise infrastructure now looked like another cautionary tale about arrogance disguised as innovation. I stood inside the executive governance office reviewing remediation timelines while emergency meetings unfolded non-stop across the floor outside. Employees moved through the hallways carefully now, speaking in low voices like people inside hospitals waiting for difficult news. The energy had changed completely. No more startup swagger. No more executive optimism. Just exhaustion. Melissa entered carrying revised board directives and paused beside the doorway before speaking. The board voted unanimously this morning, she said quietly. They want you to lead systems governance permanently after the audit closes. Permanently. Funny word considering how disposable they believed I was 8 days earlier. I looked back down at the remediation report spread across the desk. Hundreds of pages documenting years of ignored compliance warnings, rushed deployment approvals, and executive shortcuts justified in the name of growth. Targets. None of it happened because the engineers were incompetent. It happened because leadership rewarded speed louder than responsibility. What exactly does the board think changes by replacing one executive? I asked calmly. Melissa hesitated before answering. They believe the culture failed. For the first time all week, I actually respected the honesty. Because she was right. This was never just about Noah Whitaker. It was about an entire leadership structure built around the fantasy that experienced people could be removed without consequences as long as investor presentations remained attractive enough. Around lunchtime, I walked through infrastructure operations where younger engineers sat silently reviewing audit remediation tasks under temporary federal oversight procedures. One developer stopped me near the server monitoring wall. He looked nervous, speaking to me directly. I used to think compliance engineers were just slowing everyone down, he admitted quietly. Now I understand why you fought so hard against those shortcuts. I studied his exhausted face for a moment before answering. Most people only appreciate invisible protection after it disappears. He nodded slowly because deep down he already understood something executives learn far too late. The strongest systems inside any company are usually maintained by people leadership barely notices while things are still functioning normally. Late that afternoon, the board formally approved a complete governance restructuring plan, based almost entirely on frameworks I designed years earlier and leadership repeatedly ignored, because they reduced short-term speed. Outside the windows, snow drifted quietly across downtown Chicago, while Halcyon stock stabilized for the first time all week. Not because investors suddenly trusted the company again. Because they finally saw leadership beginning to respect the systems protecting it from collapse. 1 year later, the ballroom overlooking Lake Michigan glowed beneath soft amber lights, while hundreds of technology executives filled the annual National Infrastructure Governance Summit in downtown Chicago. Massive screens stretched across the stage, displaying this year's keynote theme in quiet blue letters. Sustainable systems require responsible leadership. Funny how the industry finally embraced words executives once dismissed as obstacles to innovation. I stood backstage adjusting the sleeve of my navy blazer, while conference organizers prepared the introduction. Beyond the curtains, I could hear conversations drifting across the ballroom. Investors, engineers, federal consultants, compliance directors from companies that suddenly cared very deeply about governance architecture after watching Halcyon nearly destroy itself publicly 12 months earlier. The audit eventually closed 6 months ago. Halcyon survived, barely. The acquisition never returned, but the company stabilized under new leadership after implementing the oversight systems they once fought against for years. Several board members resigned quietly during restructuring. Noah Whitaker disappeared from the technology conference circuit almost entirely after federal investigators concluded leadership negligence accelerated the governance failures, triggering the collapse. Not criminal, just reckless. Sometimes reputations die more painfully than companies do. Meanwhile, the remediation framework I rebuilt became the foundation for a national governance reform initiative adopted across several major infrastructure firms. Strange how quickly expertise becomes valuable once disaster proves it was necessary all along. The host stepped onto the stage as applause rolled softly through the ballroom. Please welcome Chief Systems Governance Officer Evelyn Mercer. The lights brightened while I walked toward the podium overlooking the Chicago skyline glowing against the dark winter evening outside. Hundreds of faces looked back at me now. Young engineers, senior executives, People who spent years believing speed mattered more than accountability until reality corrected them publicly. For a moment I simply stood there quietly, remembering another conference room exactly 1 year earlier where executives eliminated my position between quarterly projections and catered coffee trays because they thought experience looked outdated beside innovation. Branding. Funny how quickly power changes direction once systems begin telling the truth. I looked across the audience and noticed Daniel Reyes seated near the front beside several younger engineers from Halcyon's rebuilt governance division. They smiled when our eyes met. Not because the company collapsed, because the culture finally changed. That mattered more. I rested my hands lightly against the podium before speaking into the silence filling the ballroom. The strongest systems are rarely built by the loudest people in the room. Every screen behind me illuminated with infrastructure architecture diagrams from the original governance framework leadership once tried removing for speed. Most failures do not begin with technology, I continued calmly. They begin when organizations convince themselves responsibility is slowing progress. The audience remained completely still. Real stillness. The kind people fall into when they recognize uncomfortable truths inside their own companies. Outside the glass walls overlooking downtown Chicago, snow drifted quietly across the city, while reflections of office towers shimmered against Lake Michigan below. Somewhere among those buildings, executives were probably still making the same dangerous mistake Halcyon made a year earlier, treating invisible labor like it had no value because success looked effortless while experienced people carried the weight silently underneath it all. I paused briefly before finishing with the one lesson this entire story taught me too late. Never underestimate the people protecting systems you barely notice while they are working. Silence lingered for half a second after I stepped away from the microphone. Then the ballroom erupted into applause strong enough to shake the stage beneath my feet. Not applause for revenge. Not applause for collapse. Applause for recognition. For accountability. For finally understanding that companies survive because of the people leadership often notices last. And standing there beneath warm lights overlooking the city where my career almost ended 1 year earlier, I realized something peaceful. Halcyon did not destroy my future when they fired me. They accidentally gave me back my voice.